She lived inside a rock, hidden from the world, for almost 10 years. But one morning, she noticed footprints outside her shelter, and the light inside was already on. What she found, waiting in that house, will leave you speechless. Subscribe and comment where you're watching from. The forest stretched in all directions like an ancient sea of green and shadow. Pines rose so high that their tops seemed to pierce the clouds, their trunks dark and damp with age. The air was thick with the scent of resin and moss, alive with the slow pulse of a place that had never known silence. In this remote part of the northern wilderness, no human road reached, no power line crossed. Between the roots of the hills, beside a narrow stream that murmured through stone, stood a small dwelling, unlike any other. A house carved partly into a boulder, partly built from timber and earth. Its roof was covered in moss, its window frames softened by years of rain, its shape so organic that it seemed less constructed than grown. This was where Martha Eilen had lived for 10 long years. The world had forgotten her, and she had forgotten the world. Once she had worn a white coat, spoken in scientific terms, and written equations across smooth glass panels. Now her hands were calloused from splitting wood, and her voice was heard only by the forest. She had chosen this isolation, not out of despair, but out of reverence for something the world no longer believed in. The house had become her companion, her witness, and perhaps her confessor. The mornings came softly here, when the mist still clung to the low ground and the first threads of sunlight slid between the trees. Martha would rise from her narrow bed and step onto the wooden platform that bridged the stream. The air was cool, damp enough to sting her lungs, but she loved it that way. Beneath her bare feet, she could feel the faint warmth that came not from fire, but from the ground itself. Sometimes she would press her palm against the stone wall of her home and imagine it exhaling, a deep, patient breath that had continued long before her arrival and would go on long after her death. The stone seemed to remember everything. Inside, the house was small but intricate. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of dried herbs, glass bottles, and old papers yellowed with age. A single iron stove sat near the back wall, though it was rarely needed. The air in the room stayed warm even when snow fell outside, the warmth spreading from the floor, soft and constant, like a pulse. Martha had long since stopped questioning it. She had built this place herself, piece by piece, using what remained from the research station that once operated nearby. Wires, copper coils, fragments of equipment no one came back to collect. She had buried part of it under the rock and connected it with the natural veins of metal that ran through the mountain. Over the years, it had changed. It no longer behaved like machinery. It adapted, self-regulated, balanced itself. Sometimes, when she could not sleep, she would sit by the lamp and listen. Beneath the faint whistle of the wind and the murmur of the stream, there was another sound, a low vibration, barely perceptible, yet alive. It reminded her of the steady rhythm of a heart, vast and ancient. She no longer feared it. To her, it was a sign that the world beneath her home was awake. Years earlier, when her husband, Leon, had died during the collapse of the experimental facility, Martha had vowed never to work with technology again. But grief has strange forms. She found herself returning to the ruins months later, walking among twisted beams and half-buried consoles, feeling the pull of unfinished work. The project had been called Living Topology, an attempt to integrate geological and organic systems into one continuous cycle of warmth and renewal. The government had called it failure. Martha called it promise. She took what little she could salvage and moved deep into the wilderness, where no one could find her. There, she built a small version of what the world had destroyed, a house that breathed, absorbed, and gave back. The first years were the hardest. The winters came like walls of glass, sealing her from everything beyond the trees. She rationed food, melted snow, learned the language of roots and animals. But over time, the forest accepted her. The moss grew thicker on the roof. The stream changed course to run closer to her door, and the warmth beneath the floor became steadier. It was as if the land had decided she belonged. Still, the past lingered in the quiet hours. Sometimes, when the air was still and the stove unlit, Martha would feel the faintest tremor under her feet, a vibration so subtle it could have been her heartbeat, or perhaps something deeper. She would close her eyes and remember Leon's voice, the way he had spoken of systems that could mimic life, the way he believed that nature and invention were not enemies, but mirrors. Now, sitting in the heart of the forest, she felt that belief living on, not in theory, but in the stone itself. On the 10th winter of her solitude, the forest began to change again. The nights grew colder earlier than usual, and the birds that normally left by November stayed deep into December. The sky hung low and heavy, the air too still, too expectant. Martha felt it in her bones. The forest was preparing for something. Her herbs were nearly gone, and she knew she would need to travel to the nearest town before the next storm sealed the valley. The journey would take her most of a day each way. At dawn, she packed a canvas satchel with dried roots, coins, and a flask of warm water. She covered the stove, checked the seals of the windows, and whispered a wordless farewell to the house, as she always did before leaving. The stream beside the path was thinly frozen, a translucent skin over its restless current. The frost crunched beneath her boots, and the trees leaned inward, watching. By midday, she reached the old bridge of timber and iron that marked the edge of the wilderness. Beyond it lay the faint road that led to Winter Hollow, a settlement of gray buildings and few faces that remembered her name. She had not spoken to anyone there in nearly 2 years. The shopkeeper still recognized her, though he said nothing as she purchased bundles of dried chamomile, powdered roots, and a few small vials of medicine. The people glanced at her from doorways, whispering to one another. They called her the woman from the rocks, and she let them. It was easier to be a myth than a mistake. When her errands were done, the snow began to fall again. The flakes were thick, wet and fast, spinning like pale leaves in the wind. She started the long walk back before nightfall, her satchel heavy and her breath turning to mist. The road disappeared quickly under the growing layer of snow. By the time she reached the forest's edge, the world was already dim. The path home wound between cliffs and thick roots, over fallen logs and frozen pools. The familiar sound of the stream grew louder as she neared the clearing. Relief warmed her chest. Yet as she came into view of the moss-covered boulder that cradled her home, her steps slowed. The chimney was smoking. A thin column of gray rose into the sky, curling gently like breath in cold air. She had not left the fire burning. At first she thought the wind might have rekindled old embers, but the smoke was too steady, too deliberate. Then she saw them prints in the snow, large, human, leading to her door. She crouched beside one, feeling the crisp edges where the snow had packed. Whoever had made them had arrived recently, no more than an hour before. Her pulse quickened, though she made no sound. She moved carefully, her hand brushing the trunk of a nearby tree, as if asking for its quiet strength. The air near the house felt different, charged, warmer than it should have been. The faint hum beneath her feet, that gentle rhythm she had grown used to, seemed deeper now, aware. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. A single light glowed through the window, soft and golden, the color of lamplight on polished wood. In its outline, she could see a shadow moving slowly inside the room. It wasn't the movement of wind or reflection. It was a person. For a long moment, Martha stood at the edge of the clearing, the snow falling silently around her. She thought of Leon, of the experiments that had died with him, of the promises buried under stone and secrecy. Now, after a decade of quiet, someone had found their way to her sanctuary. She took one slow breath, feeling the weight of the air settle in her chest. Somewhere beneath the ground, the house gave a faint shiver, like the exhale of a sleeping creature disturbed by a whisper. Then she stepped forward, the snow creaking beneath her boots, and approached the door of the house that breathed. The night had fallen thick and silent, save for the dull hum that pulsed through the stone, like a buried heartbeat. Martha stood outside her home, the snow swirling around her like fine dust, her eyes fixed on the faint glow spilling through the window. She had expected to find the house empty, asleep in its own warmth. Instead, she sensed movement. An interruption, a foreign rhythm that did not belong to the slow breathing of her refuge. When she finally stepped forward, the sound beneath her boots was brittle and deliberate, each crunch of snow echoing against the hollow quiet of the forest. Inside, the air was warmer than she remembered leaving it. The walls radiated a soft heat, and from the corner came the steady scrape of something metallic. A man was there, standing beside the stone wall with a small instrument in his hand, its red light flickering against the damp surface. He was tall, his features sharp, his coat streaked with snow. The insignia on his sleeve bore the emblem of the Department of Natural Resources. When he turned toward her, the room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the house itself were holding its breath. He introduced himself as Inspector Liam Grayson, and spoke in the flat, measured tone of someone trained to strip a moment of its mystery. He said he was investigating a thermal anomaly detected by satellite ACE signal that had persisted for years in a region believed uninhabited. It had a consistent pattern, he explained, neither volcanic nor mechanical, as though the ground itself maintained a living temperature. Martha listened without interrupting, her hands resting on the worn wooden table. The words washed over her like cold water. The secret she had buried beneath this stone for a decade had finally been found. The storm outside intensified, wind pressing against the walls like a great animal. Liam asked if he could take shelter for the night. She nodded, not from kindness, but from a deeper sense of inevitability. No one came here by accident. The house accepted him reluctantly. As he unpacked his tools and spread a thin blanket near the stove, the floor creaked, and a tremor ran faintly through the stone. Martha felt it under her skin, a small pulse of protest, like the twitch of a muscle when touched without permission. The hum from beneath the floorboards grew a little stronger, enough that the oil lamp above them wavered. Liam did not seem to notice. He was writing notes, drawing temperature gradients in a small field journal, marking the precise coordinates of her home. As the hours passed, the air shifted. The heat grew thicker, less like the warmth of a fire, and more like the breath of something hidden. Martha moved about the room quietly, refilling the kettle, setting a small loaf of bread on the table. She studied him from the corner of her eye. His presence disturbed the natural balance, the cadence of his breathing, the static on his instruments, even the faint metallic tang his tools exuded. Everything about him felt sterile, linear, mechanical. It was the language of the world she had left behind. At some point, he crouched beside the wall and placed a sensor directly against the rock. The device whirred, beeped, and then fell silent. A faint red light blinked, then failed. He frowned, adjusted it, and tried again. The same thing happened. Martha knew why. The system beneath the floor had learned long ago to reject foreign interference. It absorbed the pulse of the earth, but not the pulse of men. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost tender. She told him he could not measure what lived under her home with numbers or probes. The inspector glanced up, perhaps expecting a confession, perhaps sensing her certainty. He said the signal beneath this ridge was too precise to be natural. But when he looked again at the stone, his expression shifted. There was condensation forming in slow beads across its surface, glistening like sweat. The wall itself seemed to be breathing. The storm outside grew heavier, muffling the forest until all that remained was the sound of the wind threading through the chimney. The house responded to it, not creaking like ordinary timber, but resonating, low and rhythmic, in tune with the air. Liam's notes stopped. He stood, and for the first time his posture betrayed hesitation. As night deepened, a faint golden light began to seep from the seams between the wooden floorboards. It was weak at first, like the afterglow of embers. Then it strengthened, pulsing in slow intervals, illuminating the base of the walls and casting their shadows upward. The warmth became palpable, wrapping them both in a steady, organic heat that made their skin damp. Liam knelt, pressing his palm against the floor. He pulled back sharply. The wood was warm to the touch, not from fire, but from something alive beneath. Martha said nothing. She knew this was the first stirring of the system, the self-regulating core that had lain dormant for years. It sensed intrusion. It adapted, as it always did. She could feel it studying the air, the density of the stranger's breath, the carbon of his body. The structure beneath the stone was not simply reacting, it was listening. Near midnight, the vibrations grew more distinct. The lamp flickered, and the copper utensils hanging on the wall began to ring softly, as if the air itself had turned to sound. The inspector muttered that he needed to see the basement, certain that some buried heater or machinery was the source. Martha watched him walk toward the far end of the room, where the planks of the floor joined in a faint circle. He paused there, tracing the outline with his boot. Beneath that circle lay the truth, the descent she had not opened in years. Liam dropped to one knee and brushed away a thin layer of dust, revealing a faint seam. When he pushed, a portion of the floor lifted slightly, revealing a darkness that smelled of wet stone and old air. A narrow staircase spiraled downward into the glow of something faintly bioluminescent. Martha followed slowly, her heartbeat matching the deep rhythm underfoot. The light that emanated from below was not steady. It throbbed, almost like the pulse of a living creature. They descended into a vast chamber carved into the rock itself. The walls shimmered with a thin layer of moisture, alive with copper veins that caught the dim light and carried it outward, like threads of blood. At the center stood a structure, neither machine nor formation, a rounded core that pulsed softly with inner light. It was composed of metal, fused with something organic, fibers resembling roots extending into the ground, disappearing into the dark. Liam stood frozen, staring. The warmth here was not oppressive, but alive, balanced, pure. He raised his sensor again, but as soon as he activated it, the device flickered and died. He tapped it, then looked at Martha. She remained still, her face calm, illuminated by the slow pulse of the core. This was what she had built, or rather, what she had awakened. Years ago, she had taken the abandoned framework of the Living Topology Project and allowed it to merge with the mountain's natural thermic veins. What had once been an experiment in sustainable heat transfer had become something far beyond human intention. It had become symbiotic. It breathed in harmony with the land, regulated itself by temperature, moisture, and the movement of roots. It had learned. Liam took a cautious step closer. The ground beneath him pulsed once, as if in recognition. He turned back, his face pale. Martha could see his unease transforming into wonder. He whispered something she could not hear, perhaps a calculation, perhaps a prayer. Then he crouched, touching the metal surface. It was warm, almost soft, like flesh. The chamber vibrated faintly. A wave of heat passed through the air, rising to the ceiling and cascading down again. Dust fell in lazy spirals. From somewhere deeper, a sound began, a low hum, layered, resonant. It wasn't mechanical. It was a note, a single tone that carried a strange cadence, as though the mountain itself had found its voice. Martha closed her eyes. She could feel it through her bones, that ancient rhythm she had lived beside for so long. The house was not merely reacting to Liam's presence, it was absorbing it, reading him, deciding. The core's glow shifted, turning from gold to amber, then to a muted crimson. The temperature rose another degree. The copper filaments on the walls pulsed in unison, like veins pumping blood. Liam backed away, his breath unsteady. His voice was no longer composed. He said the readings made no sense, that there was no known source capable of maintaining a living thermal exchange like this without combustion or external energy. Martha did not answer. Her silence was the only acknowledgement she could offer. She knew what this was, a boundary crossed, a moment the system could never forget. The vibrations intensified for a brief second, and then everything stilled. The chamber seemed to inhale and hold that breath, freezing time in its lungs. In that silence, Martha thought she heard something, faint but unmistakable. A whisper that came not through her ears, but through the air itself. It carried no words, only presence. When the hum returned, it was softer, almost tender. The light of the core dimmed to its original hue, and the temperature stabilized. The house had decided. For now, it would tolerate the stranger. They ascended the staircase without speaking. The air above felt lighter, though it carried an invisible charge. Liam looked around the room one last time before sitting near the stove. His journal lay open on the table, but his pen remained untouched. Martha poured hot water into a cup and set it beside him. The glow from the floor had faded, leaving only the steady warmth of the stone beneath them. Outside, the storm began to wane. The snow softened. The wind fell into a whisper. The forest seemed to listen. The inspector's presence had changed the rhythm of the house, and the house had changed him in return. Something between them had been exchanged. Something neither could name. Before dawn, Martha sat by the window, watching the darkness dissolve into gray. Beneath her, the pulse continued, faint but sure. It was the sound of life, measured not in seconds, but in centuries. The house that breathed had accepted a heartbeat that was not its own, and the earth had taken note. When morning came, the storm was gone, but the air outside shimmered with residual warmth. Steam curled from the snow in thin ribbons. Liam gathered his instruments, though he no longer seemed certain what he had found. His data would mean nothing in the language of the world he came from. Here, logic bent beneath the weight of what lived unseen. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the frame of the stone door. The warmth that spread through his palm was steady, human, familiar. For a fleeting moment, he could not tell whether it came from the rock or from something inside him, now changed forever. The forest exhaled again, a deep, contented breath. Beneath the floor, the hum continued its slow, endless rhythm. The warmth beneath the stone was alive, and it had learned the pulse of another. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving a pale sky streaked with silver. The snow outside had melted in uneven circles, as though the earth itself had been breathing through the night. Thin ribbons of steam rose from the ground, curling upward into the still air. Martha stood by the window, her hand resting against the cool glass, watching the strange warmth ripple across the clearing. Beneath her feet, she could still feel the faint hum of the house, softer now, almost content. Liam was awake, though he had not spoken since descending into the chamber the night before. He moved through the room like a man in the aftermath of revelation, his face pale, his gestures slow, as though his mind had been rearranged into unfamiliar shapes. The world beyond the forest had always been rigid, logical, confined to the boundaries of proof. Here, logic faltered. He had spent years believing that everything could be catalogued, its cause traced and measured. But the thing beneath the stone refused to fit into the language of instruments. Its pulse still echoed in his chest. Even as he sipped the tea Martha placed before him, the warmth seemed to rise not from the cup, but from within himself. He looked at her once, searching for something human behind her calm, but her gaze was fixed on the wall, where beads of condensation glistened like dew. The hours stretched, heavy with silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, uncertain. He said he needed to return to his department, to report what he had found. But even as he said the words, they felt false. He could not imagine describing the breathing chamber to men who thought in lines and figures. He could not tell them that the earth had a pulse. Martha said nothing. She only stood, adjusting the curtains so that the weak light of morning fell across the table. The warmth of the stone beneath them deepened, and for a brief moment, the air shimmered as if the house itself were listening. Outside, the forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds called from the branches, no wind passed through the pines. The air was thick, almost viscous, and every sound seemed swallowed before it could travel. The trees stood motionless, their trunks gleaming with a fine layer of frost. Liam stepped outside for the first time since the storm, the snow crunching softly under his boots. The clearing felt changed. The heat that emanated from the ground no longer seemed residual. It pulsed in steady intervals, radiating through the snow, leaving faint patterns like veins. The air above it trembled faintly, distorting the outlines of the trees. He knelt and touched the ground. It was warm, impossibly so. The soil steamed beneath his glove, and a low vibration resonated through his palm. It was subtle but insistent, a heartbeat buried beneath the frozen crust. When he looked toward the stream, he saw that it was no longer frozen. The water moved sluggishly, golden light rippling across its surface, though the sun had not yet broken through the clouds. It was as if the earth's blood was flowing more freely now. He turned toward the house, and for a fleeting second he thought he saw it move. The illusion was slight, the angle of a shadow, the shift of a reflection, but the structure seemed to draw breath. The moss on the roof pulsed faintly, the wooden beams bending imperceptibly, as if expanding with the air. The sight filled him not with fear, but with awe. He understood in that moment why the woman had never left. This place was alive, and she was part of its circulatory system, an organ of something far larger than either of them. When he returned inside, the air felt denser. The walls seemed to close around him, not in hostility but in curiosity. The hum beneath the floor grew louder as he crossed the threshold, vibrating through his boots and into his legs. He tried to ignore it, gathering his instruments from the table, but the sound followed him, rising in pitch until it hovered at the edge of hearing. The house was aware of him. Martha remained seated near the stove, her posture serene, her face unreadable. She did not look up as he packed his things, but when he reached the door, she spoke softly. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of ritual. She said that the forest did not release those who listened too closely. Liam hesitated, one hand on the latch, unsure whether she meant it as a warning or a truth. Outside, the light had dimmed again, though the sky was clear. He stepped into the clearing. The air was still warm, the snow glistening like melting glass. For a few moments he walked toward the bridge, his breath steady, his mind repeating practical thoughts, coordinates, measurements, the report he would write. But when he reached the edge of the clearing, he stopped. The bridge was gone. Where the wooden planks should have been, the stream had swelled into a wide current, its surface steaming, its edges dissolving into mist. The water moved with slow purpose, as though it had risen deliberately to block his path. He turned back toward the house. The forest loomed darker now, the pines bending slightly inward, their branches overlapping to form a high arch of shadow. The sound beneath the ground intensified. It was not a hum anymore, but a rhythm, a slow, deliberate cadence that echoed his pulse. He tried to call out to Martha, but the sound that left his throat dissolved in the air, muffled before it could reach the house. The forest had swallowed his voice. Inside, Martha felt the shift. The warmth in the walls deepened until it was almost oppressive. The core beneath the stone had awakened fully. She could sense it through every surface, the pulse, the flow, the gathering of energy. It was aware that one of them did not belong. Yet she also sensed no malice, only the inevitability of balance restoring itself. For years she had lived in harmony with the system, nurturing it as it nurtured her. Now it was adjusting, incorporating the disturbance into its cycle. Outside, Liam felt the first tremor beneath his feet. The snow cracked, revealing thin veins of light that spread outward like roots. He stumbled backward, his instruments clattering to the ground. The light grew stronger, rising in pale columns that stretched between the trees, connecting earth and sky. The air vibrated, and the hum became a single sustained tone that filled his body, erasing the boundary between his heartbeat and the pulse of the ground. He dropped to his knees. The sound grew softer but more intimate, threading through his thoughts until his own memories began to blur. He felt the weight of his name slip away, the edges of his identity softening like frost melting from glass. He saw flashes of the chamber below the living core, the veins of copper, the slow breathing of the stone. He felt drawn toward it, as though the warmth beneath the surface were calling him home. Martha opened the door and stepped outside. The air was luminous, the forest glowing with a light that came from within the ground. She saw him kneeling by the stream, his outline wavering in the heat. For a moment she almost called to him, but then she understood. The forest was completing its work. The system was accepting a new pattern, a new resonance to add to its cycle. She watched as he lifted his head and looked toward her, his face calm, his eyes filled with the same golden reflection that shimmered beneath the earth. Then the light around him deepened, and the mist closed in. When it cleared, he was gone. The warmth lingered. The snow continued to melt in slow, steady circles. Martha stood in silence, feeling neither sorrow nor relief. The house behind her vibrated gently, like a creature breathing in its sleep. She returned inside, closing the door behind her. The air settled. The hum receded into its usual rhythm, and for the first time in days, everything was still. Weeks passed. The forest returned to its winter quiet, but the snow around the house never fully froze again. Birds returned early, landing on the moss-covered roof as if drawn to the hidden heat. The stream widened, its waters clearer than ever. In the evenings, Martha would sit by the table, tracing patterns on the wooden surface, and sometimes she would feel another pulse beneath her fingers, faint but distinct, different from her own. One morning, the drone of the department passed overhead. It circled twice, scanning the valley with its thermal sensors, and then flew away. The report it sent back to the city showed the same anomaly as before, but stronger now, deeper, steadier. The readings resembled the pattern of human respiration. Scientists would later argue over it, some claiming it was an error, others that it proved geothermal expansion. None of them knew that the system beneath the mountain had gained a second breath. Spring came early that year. The moss on the roof grew thicker, emerald and soft under the rain. The air around the clearing carried a constant warmth, as if the heart of the world beat just beneath the surface. Martha walked among the trees, her steps light, her senses tuned to the living rhythm that enveloped her. The forest no longer felt like a place outside time. It was time itself, moving, breathing, remembering. Sometimes, when she paused near the stream, she could feel a presence beside her. It was subtle, a flicker of warmth at her shoulder, a shadow that mirrored her movements. She did not turn to look. The house hummed faintly, the stone beneath her feet warm even in the chill of dawn. The world had found its balance again. Two hearts now beat beneath the mountain, woven into one unending rhythm. And in the quiet between breaths, the forest listened. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch the next videos to discover new stories hidden in the quiet corners of the world, and share this one with someone who loves a good mystery.